Okay, hi again. This is Scott Segrist, and I'm going to talk about practical legacies of the classical Christian tradition. This one can be pretty short and sweet, just kind of wanting to pull away what is relevant from those classical and Christian political theorists for today. The first thing I would point to is the natural law tradition, which really gets formalized and theorized first by Thomas Aquinas, but has roots back with the previous thinkers as well. Uh, with the natural law tradition, you get higher standards of justice, uh, the conception of what those standards are, how we should understand them, and how to apply them to politics, how to make just laws, how to evaluate whether a regime is being just or not, and whether laws are just or not. And this is all background to um, human rights, the conception of human rights, that there are certain ways we should not treat other people. And although the ancients usually talked about this in terms of our duties or our obligations to others, uh, it clearly implies that there's something about those others that demand that we don't treat them wrongly, and that is that they're human beings with their own dignity. Christians saw this in terms of man being made in the image of God, but that human beings, well, you see in the Declaration of Independence, expressed as uh, that all are created in the it doesn't say the image of God, but that all are equal in being created with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what this basically means is that people's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness should not be violated. They should not be victims of injustice, in other words. These things can only be forfeited through crime or something like that. You can lose your liberty, put in prison for doing something wrong, but outside of that context, in the context of not doing anything that should be corrected or punished, everyone has these rights, no matter what status, no matter how smart or stupid, no matter how uh, meritorious they are. Everyone must be respected in this way, right? And the great illustration of this in the American context, and I alluded to it before, is with Martin Luther King Jr. and his argument in the letter from a Birmingham jail. He explicitly uh, references Socrates and Augustine and Aquinas in making his argument. He's the context of that letter is that some white clergymen who, in general, are supposedly on uh, King's side are not supporting him in his campaign of civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, breaking, for example, the permit, the ordinance requiring a permit for parade or something like that uh, in Birmingham. But the reason that they had made this and the reason and the way they were applying it was to prevent blacks from protesting in Birmingham. But these clergymen were saying, well, how can you justify breaking the law? And he said he appealed to explicitly to Augustine and Aquinas as part of his argument that um, that one has an obligation to obey every just law, but one has an obligation to disobey an unjust law. And uh, so that's how he justified this civil disobedience campaign of the black protesters, and well, whites too involved in those protests, but primarily blacks. Um, and so the American Civil Rights Movement was underpinned by a philosophy of justice that comes from the ancients. Something to bear in mind. Second thing, that's a natural law tradition, important practical legacy. The second thing is the conception of regime types that Plato and Aristotle developed. Uh, there are different regime types that can be understood in terms of their structure of power and in terms of the values of the people, of the communities. This kind of thing is in the background of comparative politics fields. Plato and Aristotle really pioneered this systematic comparison of regime types. Third thing, the idea of mixed government, our separation of powers and checks and balances to check tyranny. That all comes out of the classical tradition originally too. Remember, Aristotle had said that one way to make one of the bad regimes, where you can't do really anything with a tyranny, the one-man tyranny. Maybe you can soften it a bit as an advisor or something like that, but there's not really much you can do with it. But with an oligarchy or a democracy, meaning again, democracy being a bad regime because it's he's thinking of a strict majoritarian regime, which involves some element of majority tyranny. The minority rights are not respected. That oligarchy and democracy can both be made better by combining them, and so that the wealth-loving few among the oligarchs and the freedom-loving many can check each other. And this is basically checks and balances. Aristotle explicitly spelled this out in terms of offices, setting up political processes in such a way that these different parts of society were not disadvantaged at the at the by the tyranny of the other. Fourth, we have the foundations of resistance theories I mentioned with Thomas Aquinas, and it's the foundation for what he said is laid with others. The idea that you're not bound in conscience to obey an unjust law, and that in general, going all the way back to Socrates, injustice should be resisted in some way. And over time, with these Christian philosophers, and then later, you get sort of the ultimate example in Locke, the idea that this resistance could be active, and it could involve direct action against the government. It could be like King had a nonviolent civil disobedience. It could be ultimately taking up arms if things got bad enough. Fifth, a fifth practical legacy, the just war tradition and the principles of just war that we argue about, that we look to help us understand whether a war is just or not, whether going to war would be just, whether actions within war are just, whether the conclusion of a war is just. These are developed. Aristotle had, I don't know if I ever mentioned this before, but he had established the sort of original principle. He just mentions the principle, it doesn't elaborate on it at all, but he said that war should be for the sake of peace. And implicitly, he meant just peace. But it's not until Cicero and then Christian thinkers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas that this gets developed theoretically into a tradition of thought. And I would stress that this should probably be understood in terms of a tradition. It's not a just war theory. At best, it's several theories, but there are certain principles that sort of get established that are generally agreed upon. It should only go to war when it's necessary. War it should never be for the sake of just conquest and plunder, uh, et cetera, et cetera. These principles get established, but it's a tradition in the sense that these are always debated in terms of what they mean, in terms of how they should be applied. So it's very possible to get uh, debates over the justice of a war where people using the same principles come to different conclusions. You saw this, for example, with the Iraq invasion of 2003. You had people making just war arguments on both sides. And it may be, in fact, that both sides in many of these debates were essentially correct on the question of justice, and the question of whether we should have gone to war boils down to a question more of prudence rather than justice. I mean, whether it was the wise thing to do, as opposed to whether it was just, because it could be just without being wise uh, under the circumstances. So that's number 5. Number 6, the practical legacy, is that with the Christians you had this groundwork for modern church-state relations, or relations between religion and politics. With Christianity, right from the very beginning, I mean, Jesus himself sort of suggested that you should render to God the things that are God's, and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And that suggested a separation of a kind of separation implicitly, that there's separate jurisdictions for human authorities and spiritual authorities, and that the human authorities as well as the spiritual authorities were legitimate and they each had a claim on us. And that's kind of how it gets developed in the Christian tradition, especially in the West, the Roman Catholic tradition, and continue on in the Protestant traditions, that the that they're separate jurisdictions, and there's a lot of struggle to finally come to the the conclusion that tended to be accepted in the West, which was the American solution of institutional separation of church and state. That it really couldn't work, and it was too much potential for corruption if they're tied together in that way. You can say, and we'll talk about this more later when we get to American political thought, that the direction of American political thought on religion and politics took a little different direction than it did in Europe. I mean, in France, it involved a thoroughgoing secularization. Religion should be strictly private matter. And whereas in America, there was an institutional separation, but there was never really outside of a few pockets of people who push for this, there was never really a total separation of religion and politics. Separation from church and state, yes, but not so much religion and politics. And Martin Luther King Jr. is a great example of that. I mean, here's a Baptist minister leading a political movement specifically designed to influence public policy and law. So that's a little different in the American side of this than you see some other places in the West. The last practical legacy I'll point to is what you get from Augustine, this conception of history as progress. Now, Augustine was not a progressive in the modern sense of the term. Progressives in the modern sense of the term think history has a right side and a wrong side, that there is progress in history in some fundamental sense. And Augustine does not assume that. He does not assume that things will get better and better. He does not assume that human society will get more and more just. Or it's doubtful that he even thinks that's possible. He thinks it can get more just, that justice will be fragile, that it probably will break down at some point, that regime will be replaced by another regime, etc. In that sense, the the development of history is kind of more cyclical, I think, in his view, in terms of earthly regimes and earthly progress, especially on a moral level. I don't think he thinks there is upward and onward moral progress, uh, while there may be progress in other areas. Um, and then there was that point I made on in the in the lecture with Augustine, that modern, and progressives are an example of this, modern political thinkers tended to keep this idea of history having a direction, but uh, think that human beings could figure out how it all worked, take control of the process, and achieve uh, some kind of utopian state on Earth. Varying degrees of that. With progressives, for example, it's not a real clear-cut end point, whereas it was for for hardcore leftists like the Marxists. Um, but uh, but that conception of history as progress of some kind or another has stuck, and been very influential, both for good and ill. One last word on idealism. In terms of international affairs, the classical and Christian traditions tend to get put into the category of idealism as opposed to realism. Um, and that's because these thinkers uh, focus on moral questions and insist on keeping justice as a first priority for political reflection and decision making. Um, and that's true. That's all true, but these thinkers should not be confused with utopians. It would be more correct to call them anti utopians for two reasons. One is they all affirm a transcendent reality beyond this world, uh, transcendent divine reality of some kind. And they stress the primacy of extra political concerns. I mean, for Plato and Aristotle, philosophy is ultimately something higher and better and beyond politics, even though it needs politics, uh, because man is a political animal, than politics. For Christians, religion and religious concerns is higher, separate, and above politics, even though it's engaged in politics, right? And this affirmation of a transcendent divine reality uh, means that, and this is my second point, that they all recognize definite limits of politics. That because there are things more important in politics, politics can never be the be all and end all, and there are limits to what politics can do. Um, Politics cannot be, for these people, a means of salvation. It cannot produce virtue. It cannot produce heaven on earth. Um, in this sense, these characters were very much realists, uh, and even anti-idealists in a sense. Not because they wouldn't try to do better, improve things in every way possible, strive for justice, but because they were keenly aware of, or thought it was the case, that human beings have this proclivity to corruption, to loving the wrong things, to letting their passions get out of control. This is a um, this is a problem endemic to humanity. It's not going to go away. Outside of Christians' thought, the ultimate divine transformation of reality, that is something we have no control over. That is something God will do in His own time, and in this world, we do the best we can, but we can't expect perfection. Um, so, uh, that's how I would characterize the practical legacies of the classical and Christian philosophers. Hopefully, you'll find it worthwhile to continue reflecting on those achievements.